Football didn't change overnight. Most people never saw it happen. One season became another. One generation replaced the last. And little by little, the game began to feel different. Jimmy Greaves noticed. Not because he hated modern football. He didn't. And not because he believed everything used to be better. He didn't believe that either. His warning was much simpler. Football was becoming so determined to look important that it was forgetting how to simply be football. Today, the game is bigger than ever, richer than ever, smarter than ever. Every pass is analysed. Every mistake is replayed. Every opinion becomes a debate. Yet something feels missing. Not the talent, not the passion. Something far harder to explain. Years later, Greaves summed it up in one sentence. The world doesn't laugh anymore. Most people ignored him. Another retired footballer. Another nostalgic opinion. But they missed the point. Greaves wasn't attacking today's players. He wasn't complaining about modern wages. He wasn't asking football to stop evolving. He believed progress was inevitable. But he also believed progress came with a price. A price no trophy, no statistic, and no television camera could ever measure. Because football wasn't only losing its simplicity, it was losing its personality. Greaves understood that better than almost anyone. He had conquered football on the pitch. Then he conquered it on television. Very few people have ever seen both worlds so closely, and even fewer recognized the change while it was happening. Subscribe now, because football's greatest voices should never be forgotten. Before Jimmy Greaves became one of Britain's most loved broadcasters, he had already become one of England's greatest footballers. Jimmy Greaves never needed to tell people how good he was. The game had already done it for him. Bill Nicholson wanted him. Alf Ramsey trusted him. Defenders dreaded him. Supporters expected one thing: a goal. Week after week, Greaves delivered. For Chelsea, for Tottenham, for England, 44 goals in just 57 international matches. Numbers like that don't happen by accident. But goals weren't what made Jimmy Greaves different. It was how easily they arrived. Former opponents often spoke about the same thing. You could mark him for 89 minutes, switch off once, and the ball was already in your net. Football writer John Moynihan called it devastating nonchalance. Everything looked relaxed. Nothing actually was. Greaves saw football one step earlier than everyone else. Not because he ran harder, because he thought quicker. That gift turned him into one of England's greatest forwards. But years later, the same football mind noticed something else. The game itself was changing. Not in one season, not after one rule. Slowly, almost invisibly. Most supporters accepted it. Many never even questioned it. Jimmy Greaves did. Because the man who could read a football match better than almost anyone eventually started reading football itself. And what he saw left him deeply concerned. Jimmy Greaves reached football's biggest stage. Then everything changed. England arrived at the World Cup with enormous expectations. Greaves was their first choice centre forward. He started the tournament. Then came France. A heavy challenge. A serious cut to his shin. Suddenly, England needed another striker. Alf Ramsey turned to Geoff Hurst. At first, it looked temporary. Greaves expected to return. Then Hurst scored against Argentina. England kept winning. Ramsey stayed with the winning team. Greaves recovered. His place didn't. From the sidelines, he watched England reach the final. Then he watched Geoff Hurst make history. England became world champions. One of football's greatest triumphs became one of Jimmy Greaves' deepest disappointments. He never blamed Geoff Hurst. Years later, he admitted most managers would have made the same decision. Winning teams rarely change. But understanding a decision doesn't remove the pain. Greaves eventually received his World Cup winner's medal decades later. By then, history had already been written. That experience stayed with him. Football moves on. Sometimes, even without its greatest players. Years later, Jimmy Greaves recognized that feeling again. Only this time, it wasn't England moving on. It was football itself. When football ended, Jimmy Greaves wasn't prepared. For years, everything in his life had revolved around one thing. Saturday afternoon, the dressing room, the next match. Then suddenly, it was gone. The goals stopped. The crowds disappeared, and the silence became difficult to escape. Greaves later admitted he lost himself. Alcohol slowly took control. The footballer millions admired was fighting a battle almost nobody could see. His family suffered. His career disappeared. And for a long time, so did Jimmy Greaves. Then, everything changed. He stopped drinking. One day became 1 week. 1 week became another. Slowly, he started rebuilding the life football had almost taken away. Writing came first. Television followed. At first, nobody knew what to expect. One of England's greatest goal scorers, standing in front of a camera. But something unexpected happened. People didn't just admire Jimmy Greaves. They enjoyed being around him. He wasn't pretending to be perfect. He wasn't trying to sound clever. He spoke like someone supporters had known for years. He could make people laugh, then make them think, without ever sounding like he was giving a lecture. It wasn't long before television realized Jimmy Greaves had found a second career, and this one would make him famous all over again. Then came Ian St. John. Together, they created something football had never really seen before. 2 former players. No scripts. No fake arguments. No shouting. Just football. The chemistry was immediate. Greaves made people laugh. St. John kept everything moving. One joked. The other replied. It never felt forced. That was the secret. Supporters weren't watching 2 presenters. They were watching 2 old football men talking the way football people actually talked. The program quickly became part of Saturday. For millions, the weekend didn't truly begin until Saint and Greavsie was on television. It wasn't trying to prove how intelligent football had become. It reminded people why they loved football in the first place. There were interviews, predictions, stories from dressing rooms, plenty of laughs, and underneath it all, real football knowledge. Years later, Gary Neville admitted the program helped him understand the game as a young supporter. That mattered, because Greaves never believed football had to choose between knowledge and entertainment. He believed it could have both. You could teach people without talking down to them. You could analyze football without making it feel like a university lecture. That was the difference. Greaves never treated football as something too important to smile about. Millions agreed, but while supporters were enjoying that version of football, the game itself was changing, and it was about to change forever. Then came 1992, a year that changed English football forever. The Premier League was born. Television rights were sold. Everything became bigger. Bigger audiences, bigger sponsors, bigger money. Sky won the battle for live football. ITV lost it. Almost overnight, Saint and Greavsie disappeared. Not because supporters stopped watching, not because Jimmy Greaves had changed. Football had. The game was entering a new era. One built around television, around branding, around selling football across the world. Much of it was good. Broadcasts became better. Camera angles improved. Players earned what previous generations could only dream about. English football reached millions of new supporters. Greaves never denied any of that. But he believed something else was happening. Football wasn't just becoming more professional. It was becoming more careful, more polished, more controlled. The game was starting to sound different. Players chose safer words. Managers revealed less. Television became longer. The conversations became more serious. Greaves looked at that world and wondered whether football was slowly forgetting its own personality. Not because people loved football less, but because they were being taught to experience it differently. The weekend ritual had become a global business. Supporters became customers. Football became content. And the voice that had once made millions smile no longer seemed to fit the direction the game had chosen. Jimmy Greaves wasn't left behind by supporters. He was left behind by the football industry itself. Jimmy Greaves never claimed modern football was bad. That was never his argument. He knew the game had improved. Players became fitter. Training became smarter. Medical care extended careers. Television brought football to every corner of the world. None of that bothered him. What bothered him was what progress quietly replaced. Football became more polished, but sometimes less personal. Players became media trained. Interviews became predictable. Too many opinions sounded exactly the same. Greaves believed football had always been at its best, when personalities were allowed to breathe. When players spoke honestly. When supporters felt close to the people wearing the shirt. Not every joke from his generation belongs today. Football has changed for good reasons too. Some old attitudes deserve to disappear. Greaves would have understood that. But he also understood something many people still recognize. A football match is more than tactics, more than statistics, more than endless debate. It is emotion, memory, connection. Those things cannot be measured, and they cannot be manufactured. That is why his words still resonate. Not because he wanted football to return to the past, but because he didn't want it to lose the parts that made people fall in love with it in the first place. For years, Jimmy Greaves sounded like a man looking backwards. Today, his words sound very different. Football has never had more experts, more cameras, more statistics, more analysis. Yet supporters still search for something simpler. A player who speaks honestly. A manager who says what he really thinks. A program that feels natural, not manufactured. That is exactly what Greaves feared football might lose. Not its quality, its character. He understood something the modern game still struggles to balance. Football is a business, but it can never survive as only a business. It is entertainment, but it can never survive as only entertainment. Above everything else, it has to remain human. That was the football Jimmy Greaves loved. A game where supporters laughed, argued, celebrated, and felt close to the people on the pitch. Perhaps that is why so many still remember him, not simply because of the hundreds of goals or the television success, but because he reminded people that football was never supposed to feel distant. It was supposed to belong to everyone. And maybe that was the warning people should have listened to all along. Jimmy Greaves never wanted football to stop changing. He understood that every generation brings something new. Better players, better stadiums, better technology, a bigger game. He never argued with that. What he feared was that football might become so busy chasing the future that it forgot what made people fall in love with it in the first place. Because most supporters don't remember football through statistics. They remember where they were, who they watched it with, the voices coming from the television, Saturday afternoons, the excitement before kickoff, the laughter, the arguments, the stories shared long after the final whistle. Jimmy Greaves belonged to that football. A football that felt closer, warmer, more personal. Not because it was perfect, but because it never forgot the supporters. That is why his legacy reaches far beyond the goals, far beyond the medals, far beyond television. He reminded millions that football was never just 90 minutes. It was family, friendship, memory, a feeling that stayed with you long after the match had finished. Maybe that is why so many people still miss those days. Not because every player was better, not because every match was greater, but because of how football made them feel. Perhaps Jimmy Greaves understood that before anyone else. And perhaps that is why his voice still matters today. The world doesn't laugh anymore. Maybe he wasn't asking football to go backwards. Maybe he was asking it not to forget where it came from. Subscribe now, because football's greatest legends live on through the stories we refuse to forget.